Hello, everyone. Thank you for holding. So, Masaō, how are you? Please tell us a bit about CESaRE for those who are new to the concept.
So hi everyone. So I'll get a bit more into CESA. So we have a bit of a presentation for you, trying to give you a better understanding of CESA as an NGO based in the Caribbean, and it's exactly what do we do and what do we mean by knowledge sharing within the Caribbean itself. So just as a sort of background on me, I'm one of the managing directors at CESA. And we have three others. So that would be, and these names may be familiar. We have Sasha Jatin, Michael D'Souza, and Stephanie Warren Gittins. And we originally co-founded CESA in 2017. And a bit more information on me, I'm currently in the UK. So I know I'm talking about the Caribbean, but I'm currently in the UK doing my postdoc at the University of Oxford. But I was recently in Jamaica as a lecturer at the University of the West Indies in the physics department. And so, what we're trying to do today is really give you a sense of how you can use NGOs like CESA, because we're not the only NGO, but we're trying to show you how we can use innovative tools like CESA to give you a better sense of knowledge sharing within the Caribbean so that we can create a lot more effective change within the environmental sciences as well as renewable energy and really engage NGOs, academia, and industry leaders. So that's kind of where I was going to leave it there for me now, Martin. But yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. And like today we'll be speaking a bit about, like we said, knowledge sharing, which is a component of knowledge management, which is the area that I specialize in, particularly around energy knowledge management. Um, And so during this session, we'll also be issuing some polls because we want to make sure that we engage you to know how you feel about this area and then you feel about the topic. Um, so Masaō, I'm gonna let you start your presentation.
Yeah, sure. So if you
Um,
could just make me a presenter, I'll go ahead and start with that.
yeah, so you should be getting it on your screen right now.
Yes.
I'm seeing your screen clearly.
Great. Um,
But what I'm seeing presenter mode. So I'm seeing your like back end mode. If you put it into presentation mode or full screen.
oh, I see. I see. There we go.
Perfect.
Um, thanks, Martin. So this is just a presentation, like I mentioned before, which is going to give you an idea of what do we mean by knowledge sharing in the Caribbean, as well as how can NGOs such as CESA sort of gauge and engage with industry leaders in the Caribbean to create more effective communications around the research that's coming out of the Caribbean. So if we start here, what we can see is that the region is really going through some rapid changes. Not only is it going through rapid changes economically, and we have such diversity within the different countries in terms of what they're going through in different aspects, but we can see that we can focus on three main things of rapid change. And I want to distill this largely into where we're looking at into the renewable energy surge. We can see a lot of new renewable energy injection of funds as well as projects coming into the Caribbean, as well as what do I mean by climate vulnerability and why the region is necessarily changing in its climate vulnerability. And then exactly what we're talking about here is going to be the new markets involved in renewable energy research, as well as who are the financiers of that and who's coming in to really change the region. So we're really going through a lot of change in the Caribbean. And we can see that countries such as Jamaica, where I was previously at, making some massive and substantial leaps in terms of diversifying their energy portfolio. And we can see that just this year with the Westmoreland 51 megawatt peak solar plant coming on, and that was in the western, southwestern part of Jamaica. Jamaica also has two large-scale wind farms But it's not just the large-scale renewable energy systems that we're looking at, but we also need to look at other islands and other small islands, the Dutch islands, your French Antilles, as well as any other English-speaking Lesser Antilles islands, who are engaging more with small-scale renewable energy systems, as well as consumer markets in terms of diversifying their energy access and security. And then when we talk about big change and we relate that to climate vulnerability, we can see that we are experiencing a lot of changes in the region through the varying weather patterns that were happening. And there's a big difference between weather and climate. And we can go back to that whole high school conversation where we're talking where weather is more on a short-term temporal scale. But when we're looking at climate, we're looking at the overall, what we call the climatology of the region. Is it going to be hot in January or is it going to be cold in January? Is it going to be wet in May or can I expect hurricanes to happen in this period? That's what we're talking about, the climatology. And we can see that that is really changing in the Caribbean. And as small island developing states, or the key term SIDS, you can see that we're really struggling to keep up in terms of our vulnerability. And thus, we have a lot of players as financiers, as well as NGOs and industry leaders coming into the Caribbean, as well as being flourished within the Caribbean to sort of tackle these problems. And this is where we're really looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and all of these other issues that play a key role in a sustainable development within the Caribbean. And we can see certain events like the 2017 hurricane season that happened in the Caribbean being a massive sort of impetus driving renewable energy as well as driving more low carbon futures in the Caribbean, where we have a lot of our leaders starting to take note. A bit late, but take note nonetheless. And then the new markets opening up. We now have EVs in Barbados, for instance. We have EVs sort of coming on board in Jamaica with pilot projects. We have EVs in a bunch of other countries. And we're also looking at not just EVs, but who are the actual financiers and organizations coming in to foot the bill. Very often, we don't necessarily have the economy of scale to produce these systems as our nearby neighbors of North America. And you can't just compare renewable energy development in North America and put that in the Caribbean and expect it to work the same. So who are these markets, financiers coming to play? And are Caribbean governments giving up control? Are we getting more control? And what is really happening in energy security? So you can see that there's a bit of a complexity in what's really going on in the Caribbean. And that's what we mean by knowledge sharing in terms of bringing this all together and understanding that vulnerability is driving this change. But then how do we get this information out to the people that matter the most to create the change that we need? So the Caribbean, as I have here, the Caribbean's increasing vulnerability demands more research, effective communication tools, and greater knowledge transfer. So we need to really look into different sorts of media that can play well into the research coming out of the Caribbean, and then how do we drive that into effective change and impact? So throughout this presentation, I'm just going to show you brief clips, and these clips are some sort of from our marketing material with CESaRE, just to give you a bit more information by what we mean. So this one will touch a bit more on the vulnerabilities that we're experiencing.
A closer look at the region shows that weather patterns are already changing in ways that signal the emergence of a new climate regime. Rising sea levels, more intense hurricanes, longer dry seasons, and shorter wet ones are just a few of the extremes that call for urgent solutions as many Caribbean islands struggle to build resilience to climate change. The damages expected from a warming world will have adverse effects on the Caribbean's economy as well.
And that sort of ends with this, I wouldn't say scaremonger, but this sort of, look, we need to wake up, money going down the drain aspect, where if we don't act effectively right now, we can see large losses economically throughout the Caribbean by not preparing our systems, our energy systems, by not protecting our environmental services. And this is where we can really lose a lot of money and value as a region if we don't build resilience from the get-go. And so this video will kind of give you as a clip to show you that there are many means of communicating your ideas, and they don't always have to be through a stagnant report. So we're looking at very different ways of how CESaRE or NGOs like CESaRE can play in terms of knowledge sharing. So if we look more specifically on where and how CESaRE plays a role, I'm just going to give you information. Sorry, I preempted that a bit early. But this clip is just going to give you a bit more information about CESaRE itself, an organization, and then I will give you a bit more background on our NGO.
Meet CESaRE, more than a collection of articles. The Journal of Caribbean Environmental Sciences and Renewable Energy, a modern, innovative, engaging, and open source of research publications coming out of the Caribbean. Here is where CESaRE comes in. Connecting leading academic research with proactive action is essential for building a sustainable future for the Caribbean and its energy demands.
So this is a video that really touches on, okay, we have all this research coming out of the Caribbean. We have a lot of leading academics. We have a lot of leading industry partners who are worldwide recognized. But it seems like people in the Caribbean just don't know about it. And very often we turn informally, and of course this has a sort of ring of anecdote to it through my experiences, but very informally we sort of turn to foreign leaders and experts to come and tell us how to develop our region, or come and tell us what we need to be doing in order to improve where we're going, when very often we have that groundwork in place already and it's just not being exposed in the way that it should be. So when we're looking at CESaRE itself and we're talking about the mission and where did we actually come from, you can see that we are an NGO that was incorporated in 2017, and we are incorporated in Trinidad and Tobago. So even though we're legal status in Trinidad and Tobago, and that's sort of the tax man that we pay, CESaRE has absolutely no sort of allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, and is very much a regional organization in terms of our dissemination of information. And we're quite interested in making sure that we get the right people around the same board table. So we have a vision to become the leading host and curator of Caribbean research publications. And I really want to stress that part, Caribbean research publications, because that has been something that has really faltered in the past decade or two even, where we have a lot of outdated academic journals, a lot of inactive academic journals, as well as a lot of sort of stagnated ways of sharing information to really connect with a younger generation. So that's what we mean by being the leading host and curator. And we also have a really strong mandate to connect the NGOs, the academics, as well as industry leaders within the region to really ensure that we're not just doing and saying individually what we want without connecting it to the bigger picture and end goals. We can all be doing so many different things, and the left hand and the right hand aren't talking to each other. That's where CESaRE wants to bridge the gap as an NGO. So if we look at simple little things like revolutionizing, and when I say revolutionizing, this is a strong term, but we just want to innovate even just the feel of how you communicate with your stakeholders. And so this is just a screenshot of our website, and we're trying to give a young, innovative, fresh feel. And one thing we found through our marketing research is that a lot of youth feel very external to the discussion around development within the Caribbean, because it's seen as almost this sort of ageist model where if you're not old and gray and in an academic institution, then you're not really a point source of information. So how do we get the youth more on board? And we have to do that by using more innovative and modern communication methods, as well as designs. Everything from how do you visually appeal to the youth is something that is very important and something that we take quite strongly into consideration when designing our marketing. This is now how does CESaRE and industry connect, as well as how does CESaRE and NGO publication fit in. And this really has to do with CESaRE becoming a vehicle of industry partners and NGOs to push their research through CESaRE to then get that message out. Not every NGO has the resources to be able to communicate what they want, and not every industry partner has the sort of span as well as the reach to communicate what they want. And so how do we bridge those two? So if we're looking at a simple map of the Caribbean, which we should all know by now, and Trinidad and Tobago is highlighted there as the sort of home legally of CESaRE, it's a bit bigger than that. We want to see how CESaRE can connect all of these different Caribbean regions with their own different sort of mix culturally, economically, and even energy transitions, and how we can bring those together into sort of cohesive communication model through NGOs like CESaRE. And so this is all about really moving beyond traditional means of industry connections, moving beyond just sending out your average annual report with a bunch of figures that is not going to really get somebody who is 18 years old in the University of the West Indies going to be seeing. Or even still, how do we get an academic who is in the University of the West Indies, let's say Mona campus where I was before, they've just submitted their PhD thesis, it goes to the library, they've passed successfully, but no one is going to read it other than themselves. So how do we really make sure that that research is disseminated and distilled as best as possible to ensure that we really get to where we need to be in terms of impact of the research coming out of the Caribbean? So this is all about really innovating the means that we have to communicate it. And so I'm going to show you another clip that is what we have as one of our products called Minute Briefs. And so this is where on our social media platforms, as YouTube as well, and our website, we produce just videos that are only 60 seconds long. Why 60 seconds? Because that's the longest time that Instagram allows you to post on their main section of the social media platform. And so we want to engage with people through the non-traditional means of academia, industry, and NGOs. So this is just an example of how you can share your information in different ways. So that was a Minute Brief series, which, like I said before, was just 60 seconds, and obviously that was just a clip of that. But that is showing how we can use different ways of communicating knowledge sharing. So let's look at how we can go even further. And this is where we're trying to really engage with the youth. And this is going to our upcoming educational app. And this is not only connecting academia, industry, and NGOs, but it's also getting people more involved with the research that is going on. So this app is intended to not only collect and have a repository of all the publications coming out of the Caribbean or work done on the Caribbean, but it also means that we're allowing their open access to research. Very often you produce your research and you have to pay money to put it into a journal. The journal then locks it up in a closed access system where somebody or a user has to pay to get it back out. Now, there are a few open access journals, and of course that is changing in the industry and it's growing. But when it comes to Caribbean leadership with this, we see that it's sorely missing. And that's where CESaRE is really trying to change the game, where we're trying to make everything open access. So every product that I talk to you about here is completely free to the end user, and we rely solely on donations and grants. We do not ask the users, as well as the people submitting their research, for any money. And this is all about creating open access to the information that we have, with the app being just one of those versions. For instance, this is a closed access journal called Energy Policy, a very good journal, and has a high academic ranking. But you see, if you would want something like this that talks about drivers and inhibitors of renewable energy, a qualitative and quantitative study in the Caribbean, if you didn't have the certain organizational access through your university, etc., you won't be able to get hands onto this policy paper quite easily. And so what CESaRE is trying to do is remove the static from that, as well as remove that sort of outdated model of presenting research and then give it a breath of new life. So this is where we're looking, for instance, in our podcast series.
I hope you'll join me for episode 2 of the CESaRE Voices podcast, as we take a look at the disconnect between research and industry in the field of renewable energy in the Caribbean. We'll be hearing from SolarBuzz CEO Jason Robinson.
Our mission is really, we're making energy freedom a reality for our clients.
And we'll be taking a slightly wider look with Emira General Counsel Lisa Ann Fraser.
I recognized very early on in my career that I had a passion for energy and environment.
CESaRE Voices, bringing research closer to you.
So that is just a clip from one of our podcasts where we featured again Jason Robinson and Lisa Ann Fraser. Jason Robinson is in SolarBuzz in Jamaica, and Lisa Ann Fraser is in Emira in Barbados. And we're looking at leaders in the Caribbean so that when people connect to the research that we are sharing through CESaRE, you gain a real sense of pride. Okay, this is being done in the Caribbean. I don't have to turn to some foreign or international institution in order to gain the information that I need. We're not saying exclude them by any means. Collaboration is still 100% key to get where we need to be, and especially as a young region, in terms of a young region entering globalization and global markets, we do need to rely on these industry partners and international leaders. But I feel like we need to get a bit more pride in the Caribbean in terms of who do we turn to for knowledge sharing. So it's also using things like our latest magazine called CESaRE Impacts, where we open access through academic journals and publications that were once closed access. CESaRE will then use journalists within the Caribbean to write on these pieces, and this goes into our magazine that is completely free. And this is where we featured James Elsmore, who's probably quite known to a lot of you. And we had a feature article by James on innovating sustainability, bridging sectors and islands. And we also featured a lot of research being done by Caribbean authors, who, of course, published in international journals because they're more recognized in terms of they've been around a longer time. So they publish in these international journals, but it's still closed access information. So the average person in the Caribbean can't get their hands on it. So how do we get the average person in the Caribbean to really interact with the material that we are using? So then this is another example video where we interviewed Masaō, who is from the IDB in Jamaica, to kind of explore what's happening in terms of electric vehicles in Jamaica. And this is another example of an animated video that you can use for knowledge sharing.
Jamaica, like most Caribbean countries, relies heavily on fossil fuel imports to meet its energy needs. And this is like a major drain on foreign exchange and the economic growth of the country. So one of the key steps that the government of Jamaica is taking is in the diversification of its energy matrix away from those imported fossil fuels and replacing it with more indigenous renewable energy generation. And it really has a target of a 30%.
So that's an example again of a video from our podcast series where you just got an excerpt from episode 3 where we were speaking with Malaika, and then we added this sort of animated video to give it more life and make sure that you are captivating audiences. Very often these days you find that people become a lot more busy, and so they're not really wanting to read a 60-page report. And so how can you get these little sort of song snacks or song bites where you can get a lot more information in a condensed, innovative fashion? So CESaRE allows industry, academia, and NGOs really to do a few things. And if we had to distill that into 3, it's looking at spanning networks of NGOs and academia, moving beyond your comfort zone in terms of who you communicate with. So how do we get more cross-disciplinary research? How do you make more publishing available in academic forums? So how do we get a certain standard of research where you apply that peer review model where you're being reviewed by people and experts in your field, and then you're publishing in an academic standard as well, causing industry and NGOs to engage more with academia, as well as how do we fund innovation in publication? How do we make sure that we are changing the models and the media through which we produce our information and disseminate it to the public? Because the average person in the public is not going to get your condensed, heavy jargon, industry terms through your report. And when I say they're not going to get it, I don't mean they're incapable of. I just think it's not readily and easily digestible. So we're really looking at how we can use media through things like our podcast series, the magazines like CESaRE Impact. We're looking at research publications because it is called the Journal of CESaRE, and that journal part is a strong component of what and how we share our information. And then how do we get industry to really connect with the youth that are going to be the ones driving environmental stewardship in the future? We can't turn to people that we already know. We have to make sure that we engage and foster people who are going to be the leaders to come. So with that, I thank you for your time. And I'm just now going to rejoin with Martyn to have a sort of very relaxed conversation for those of you that are still present, to kind of get an understanding of where do you think the Caribbean is in knowledge sharing, and where do you think we should be going for knowledge sharing? So Martyn, back to you.
Thanks, Masaō. Really appreciated you sharing a bit of your insights. And let's go to the polls now so that we can get a little understanding of the audience that has joined us today. Just give me 1 second, I'm going to issue. So we want to know if you think the Caribbean is making innovative strides in knowledge sharing and research dissemination. Just going to give you guys 10 more seconds, just a few more seconds to vote. All right. So as we can see from the poll results, that 60% of you said yes, and 10% said no, and 30% are not sure. Masaō, is this in line with what you would expect?
I would say that I'm slightly surprised that we had 30% not sure, because I think most people I've spoken to tend to be on the line, either side of this, not necessarily on the line. So it's interesting that we have about 40% of people not sort of either no or not sure, and 60% yes. But I am sort of comforted with the fact that 60% of people said yes, which does show that I think people are starting to recognize that the Caribbean is doing much more in terms of really engaging with different communities through the information that we share.
That's good. Yeah, I was surprised. I'm glad to see the shift. If we had done this 2 years ago, I don't think it would be at that level, but
yeah, I'm not sure we've gotten the same answer. And I don't know if those 2 years coincide with the inception of CESaRE. Is that what you're getting to? But I don't want to be biased there whatsoever. No, but I do agree that we've made recent changes in terms of how we really engage with people in the Caribbean and the medium through which we do that. I mean, right now we have the green screen going on in Trinidad, which is looking at short documentary series highlighting environmental and energy issues in the Caribbean. And that has been something that is huge and instrumental in really pushing information coming from the different islands, as well as people coming together to have these sort of, as I mentioned before, come into the same quote unquote boardroom to have these discussions and important, pertinent this dialogue around what we need to do for more sustainable futures in the Caribbean.
Yeah, and let's go to another poll. At the beginning we talked about knowledge management. I just want to see how many people are familiar with the term before we continue. Right, so this is also encouraging. 64% of the persons said yes, 27% said no, 9% unsure. This is another thing from my experience that I feel has changed in the region over the last few years. When I first started, my friends would ask, what the hell is knowledge management? And I'd just be like, well, there's a lot of knowledge in there, and I just have to get it together, and we'd have a good laugh. But
Yeah.
I myself personally have seen a change in understanding. And for those of you who are unsure or don't know, knowledge management is the process of creating, sharing, and using and basically managing the knowledge and information that an organization has. So it's very multidisciplinary, and the approach is so that you can achieve the organization's objectives by making the best use of that knowledge, or internally helping to strengthen capacity within your own organization by understanding where those gaps are. So it's a very effective tool, and we've seen it, with the CARIC platform. For those of you who don't know, CARIC is a community of practice, which is an activity that falls under knowledge management, where we create a forum for sharing of best practices around low carbon technology. And when we, in our inception, when we started, we looked at different case studies, and I mean, there are large companies like ConocoPhillips, which when they started an internal community of practice, ended up saving $900 million. I mean, they're a large global conglomerate, but when we think about the Caribbean, and Masaō and I have talked about this to over and over, when you think about how more efficient we can be, in sharing of information, and removing there's an intellectual kind of like hierarchy or hegemony that exists, where this report is power, and sometimes it's only power if it is applied. Right. And so my understanding from your presentation is, how do we make people more accepting and aware of this information, and how they can apply it? And it actually leads to a question I had for you regarding, has CESaRE thought about connecting with industry? Has industry shown a receptiveness towards collaboration, or has it been a bit of a struggle, or do you see openness happening?
So just to go back and just to give a bit of context with the knowledge sharing management, and so we did a webinar in earlier this year where we looked at big data, and a big issue that came around that, and when we were speaking to the academics as well as people that we brought on from industry, as well as some of the small medium enterprise businesses that we had on. The biggest thing that was present there is that they don't have access to data to drive their decisions. And so it's not only just collecting data from your organization standpoint, but it's also, how do you get access to data that is already out there in existence to further drive what you are trying to achieve. And so this presentation, we actually gave this presentation in a different sort of version to a clean energy conference in Trinidad. And that clean energy conference is where we were represented by Sasha Jatin Singh, who is a managing director at CESaRE, who also just gave a talk on climate change and migration at the Green Screen Forum yesterday. But she was presenting in front ministers, she was presenting in front major CEOs of major companies in the Caribbean, directors of BP, etc. And one thing we found the most interesting from there is that it was actually the oil companies whose ears started to perk up the most with CESaRE. And so we got really positive feedback in them saying, and the ironic thing there is that they were saying, oh, we didn't even know about CESaRE. So another thing is, how do we then make ourselves more visible so that we can make information more visible? And they were saying that now that they do know about CESaRE, they think it's such a great platform to be able to share the work that they are doing that they weren't able to get across through a broad, diverse reach, and sort of break down those walls against oil industries in the Caribbean and whether they're changing or not, and changing fast enough. And I know that's a whole other webinar, and I don't want to get too much into that controversial topic. But the point is that there's still an industry driving much of our economies in the Caribbean, especially in Trinidad, and you can't just exclude them. And it's not only them; it was also the government officials who have to really work with academics and industry partners, and then who's going to be the sort of middle person there or middle organization. And we're not here necessarily as an organization to mediate. We're here simply to provide open access to information as much as possible. So yeah, that was quite interesting, and that was well received at that forum.
I think that's magnificent, and it really shows, like I said, there's a hegemony to it. So larger organizations, I find, they have the publicists, they have the communications infrastructure to reach a broad audience, and usually those will be large international organizations. And I think, a lot is happening in this space already. We do have the experts, we do have the technical acumen. It's just communicating that and filtering that. And I really like your idea of an app being open access. There was an open access project in the US, the Energy Open Access Project, which was around that same concept.
Right.
And there's two sides to it, actually. I see there's the open access part, and then there's interoperability.
Yes.
Do these systems interact together?
Yes.
So that we're pulling from, I might have a similar organization as you, but it doesn't have to be competition.
Right.
It is actually competition, where our systems can pull from each other to bring the best data. And
right. And if I could,
like you said,
interject there, that is quite interesting that you said interoperable, because when I was talking about findable, accessible, and reusable, I actually left out the I, and the I is going to form the acronym FAIR, which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So it's making sure that your data is not only something that you can access, but then you have different organizations that are easy to exchange this information between themselves without it having this sort of commercial sensitivity around it. And it's not just data for financial gain, but it's data through bringing more diversity on board within your organization to then create your financial gain internally. So it's opening yourself up to more data even.
Yeah, and I mean, like, some people might ask, well, why would I do that? And then I think what you've done a good job too is framing the issue. I was at Climate Week in New York in September, and it was great to see the heads of Caribbean governments. My Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, she spoke on behalf of the collective of islands, but framing it, we have 10 years, if so much, to turn things around. And if we hold on to information, doesn't matter how much money that brings you, we create a devastating environment in reality. And so I think this is the trend that the Caribbean has to be on. And we had in the previous webinar, we talked about like AI, machine learning, blockchain, innovative technologies. I think what you're doing is trying to add that layer so that we're better positioned to have applied research.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. Maybe we should go and run the other poll question, the final one.
Yeah.
Let's see what people think of.
So we have two more actually.
Right.
We have, what aspect of knowledge sharing do you think what aspect of knowledge sharing do you think the Caribbean needs urgently? And it's not limited to this. If after you can think of other things that we may need, it'll be great if you can share them with us. But I'll just give you some more time to answer the questions for the poll. And it may very well be all of them.
Yeah, I would be very tempted to click all.
So I'll just give you a few more seconds. All right. So I am not so surprised. So 33% said virtual professional development, 22% said apprenticeship and fellowships, 11% said redeployment capacity sharing, 0% said mentorship, and
Surprised there.
33. Yeah, that one surprised me.
I would say
Um,
for mentorship, I think you know, a big issue in the Caribbean is that we very often don't have that sort of person informally to sort of drive us into where we have the ideas in our head. You know, how do we get the ideas in our head and really put it down? I mean, even when I was in my master's, thinking up of CESaRE and trying to figure out where to get it to go and what I couldn't initially turn to someone who I felt would have been able to direct me. And that's not to say there isn't anyone. Of course, there's someone. But I think it will be good to have, especially after teaching in Jamaica, a stronger establishment of mentorship programs, particularly in universities, where I think we have a sort of, I won't go too far to say archaic, but we have a sort of rigid hierarchy in terms of professor, student, um, as well as even research assistant, where there isn't much communication between those channels because we just assume if you have professor in front of your name, you know more than me, and I am just going to sit back and wait for you to come to me. And if you don't come to me, maybe I'll come to you when I feel comfortable enough.
yeah,
And so, how do we create and foster these channels where people don't have to be placed in that awkward situation and they can let their guard down and say, look, I don't really know about environmental and knowledge sharing within the Caribbean, but this is my idea. How can I get there?
yeah, and mentors for different aspects of your professional personal development. Like myself, I have a mentor for who also is a knowledge management consultant, and he's not in the field of energy like myself, but just being able to understand the history of this field and how it got to here
Yes.
has been very helpful for me. And then, I myself mentor a young student in university, and sometimes you learn more from your mentee.
Yeah.
It's not a one-way thing, is
Yeah.
what I'm kind of saying. And I think having that openness, I remember in university doing my thesis and going from undergrad to graduate, and it went from saying Professor such and such to call me by my first name, and that was
Yeah.
psychologically that creates a big
Yeah, that really bothers Caribbean people for sure.
yeah. Or have a drink with me. I was like, what, this is a trick? you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But what I joke and I jest, but that openness,
Yes.
that communication is very important in these days, and it can be applied to our work, the climate and energy work.
Yeah.
Just let's issue one more poll for the audience before we turn to questions. We want to know if your organization itself has a knowledge management strategy.
And I think it's important to just quickly touch and say, I mean, even if you're not part of an organization structurally, it could be a previous organization, it can be an organization you're more familiar with. So don't feel like if you're not currently in an organization that you can't participate in the poll.
I like this poll.
Yeah, this one's this one is where I said people go either yes or no, or there are no unsures yet, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
We're just going to give you guys 10 more seconds, and then we're going to close the poll. Okay. Right, it was fairly even until the end. 56% of you said no, and 44% said yes. I'm, I guess, pleasantly surprised. In terms of, I thought it might have been less people saying yes. How about you?
No, I mean, I guess it depends on the makeup of the audience as well. But it's
True.
good to see that as more than I thought have a sort of knowledge sharing plan. And that's not, I guess it's not really to say that I didn't think they would have one. It's just more to say probably I just didn't know. So it's good to learn that, you know, so many of you in the audience think that you have a sort of knowledge sharing plan that matches with the vision of the organizations. So that's good to see.
Yeah. So now we're going to open the questions, and just looking at the question board, I think we had more comments than questions so far. We had 2 members say they wish that that they could answer all
Yeah.
of the options. So my bad for making it a one only option, but this is good to know. This is good feedback in how we structure our individual work plans moving forward. And you know, like with this, it's all about sharing and how things can be better. And I think Ronald from Curacao, he put that mentorship is needed.
Yes.
So and thanks for that. And one thing I didn't touch on, Masaō, is another option should be there where we re-engage with people who've retired, because sometimes you have knowledge leaving organizations and leaking
Exactly.
of.
Exactly. I think that, so that's even something that we take quite seriously within CESaRE. I mean, one thing we found with organizations, especially small NGOs like CESaRE, and I want to just really stress that everything that you saw in that presentation, all of our products are not coming from any big pockets of financing. So we really do have to get creative in how do we source our money, and how do we then distill that into a product that is completely free, and then how do we have then a sustainable business model there. Because we're not for profit, but we still need to have some sort of leverage through capital. And you know, one thing we take quite seriously there is that we see so many other NGOs cropping up, and that we would love to be partners with across the Caribbean. And then we go to check in with them a few months later, and we can't find the website. And all of a sudden that has sort of crashed, or all of a sudden they can't keep it going. And it's not easy. It's not easy to sort of get that up and running. And you know, it's just like a startup. Any startup, you're going to experience a lot of challenges, and you really have to find that model that fits for you. So we recognize that with CESaRE, and we want to make sure that an integral part of making sure that CESaRE is around to last is that if anybody is going to leave the organization as a managing director, that we have that institutional knowledge captured, so that when the new person comes in, it's not like starting over from scratch. We have an established culture, we have an established ethos, and then people can quickly then onboard to be able to continue the work and vision that we had. And I think that is completely important in many organizations where people leave, and they leave with, it's almost like they take the organization with them.
Yes, yes. And I think what would help as well is like what I've observed, you know, through CARIC, is the opportunity for capacity sharing. And I mean, when we have the disasters, a lot of the utilities deploy linesmen to help the other utility.
Right.
What we're trying to build into our programming is, how do we all learn, like say all the energy storage engineers or the people responsible for energy storage at the utilities, we create a program or virtual component on on the CARIC platform where they learn around a live project that's in place. So we upskill the entire region.
Yeah.
And build that trust, because a part of sharing knowledge is trust and that sense of community.
Yeah.
So it's, I think, I don't know, seeing your presentation and building from my experience in recent conversations, I think I'm very optimistic about where it's heading, and it's refreshing. So thank you.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we want with CESaRE. We want this sort of optimistic feeling that when you look at NGO like us or any other NGO that's kind of doing this, and trust me, there are many out there in the different islands, that you get a sense of, I can be proud of the Caribbean advancements that are happening. And we are very innovative people. We're extremely entrepreneurial, and very often it's just resource that is keeping us back. And I see even Ronald has put mentorship can also be virtual, and I completely agree. We have to find sort of modern ways to get across the objectives that we need, and we don't need to be now stymied by me being in Trinidad and you being in Saint Martin. And how do we then create mentorship? So I think we need to think outside of the box a lot more, but I think it is happening. I definitely think it is happening. And I think we are becoming a lot more proud to say, you know, these are the issues we have, and we can get through it through the resources that we have as Caribbean people.
Yeah.
Shall we ask some more questions before we end in the next 5-10 minutes or so?
Yeah, sure. So when you were speaking about the app, right? And I started thinking, like, how do we get these products into the eyes of not just business to business, but into the eyes of the everyday person?
Yeah.
Have you thought through that?
Yeah. So that is where we now have a model. So we have a few things going on, and I just want to stress again: if anybody in the audience has a question, feel free to drop one in for us, and then we will address it at any time. Don't hesitate to get more involved. I think there are two things. You have to have two different models. One model is where you have the NGOs, the industry, and academics, and CESaRE can disseminate their information through the innovative products that we're coming out with. And that can be a model where the NGOs, who usually can't afford to produce this on their own, can then pay into CESaRE in a very nominal amount, in a contribution which they feel comfortable with, and then we do it on their behalf to then have it given out on free to the user. And then the app as well is more really geared towards the average person on the street in the Caribbean, who is really just trying to look for more information on climate change, on renewable energy systems, on our energy transition. You know, you hear one report saying that hurricanes are going to be awful in 2019, and then 2019 comes and the hurricanes aren't as bad. And to the average person who's not really too involved in climatology, that can be a very confusing thing. Why is it getting colder in some places? Why is it getting wetter? Why is it getting drier? Why are we having all these varied climatological responses to climate change if it's getting warmer overall in the world? And so the app is really giving access to the average person to understand what we're trying to achieve. And then through that recognition that you have to tailor your information to the audience that you're trying to target. I can't come there with the most highfalutin sort of academic jargon that is going to turn off a lot of people who have to spend 10 minutes to understand the first sentence. Again, not because of their capacity, just because the language is just inaccessible. So how do we get that across without the loss of information, but having even more impact? And so the app is just creative ways of getting information, as well as allowing industry to get on board to say that they are sharing a report, how many users engaged with it, how many users downloaded it. Big data is a big thing these days, and it's also about recognition of privacy as well.
I 100% agree. It has to be wrapped in the culture of the space. You know, like, you know, I remember when in undergrad, speaking to my family at the table, and going off about radiative forcing and, and climate forcing and these terms that, you know, it just means we are in a position we need to act now, right?
Yes.
You get the sentiment across more than the tech jargon.
Yeah.
And so I see what you're saying about having a two-sided model.
Yeah.
And you know, like something that we talked about when we first met was that collaboration is so powerful because basically the complexity of climate change, which you just alluded to, is such a complex systemic occurrence.
Yeah.
And in order to address a complex problem, you need to have complex answers or many people working at different pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate
and those
this
many
attempt.
people have to know what the other people are doing. So
Yeah,
we
exactly.
can't all get into the system where we're each building our own road to go to the same place, and then you realize there's a massive bottleneck and nobody gets to the actual location. So it's really how do we, like I mentioned before, how do we really get a more streamlined knowledge sharing within the Caribbean with recognition of our own diversities and our own visions?
Yeah, when I talk to people about knowledge management or about climate, I like to give them the metaphor of an octopus, right? Like an octopus's tentacles each move
Yeah, exactly. And
of
so
their own, but they're moving the entire organism
if I could just touch on one
in one direction.
by Rain Rolock, and I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. Rain or Ryan, excuse me, whichever one it is. It says, agreed. I fully believe in stripping away these language barriers coming from someone who has done my own research and relatively versed in the terms we need to be able to present to the general public to increase our audience and influence. Yeah, I fully agree that you are just going to be talking on deaf ears if you cannot get that information and communicate that information effectively. You know, for instance, people argue, and I'm probably going down the rabbit hole here and going completely off course, but people often argue, you know,
of course, to get back on track. So
okay, well, you put me back on track when I go too far. People often
I got you. We collaborated.
English is changing, and there's the destruction of the language, and we're speaking different dialects and Creole and whatnot. And very often you find people who are speaking probably the more broken English in, let's say, Trinidad, where I'm from, and speaking Creole with each other, have a much stronger of an understanding with themselves than they do with somebody who is really trying to retain that language, speaking, as they would say, the Queen's tongue with each other. And because the language is so complex and they're using so many different connotations and they're using very nuanced versions of the language, that they often lose what they're trying to communicate in the first place. Whereas the people speaking in Creole who know how to understand each other and understand how to communicate with each other are pretty much getting their point across. And I think that the kind of analogy I kind of structured in my head in the last 10 seconds, so if it's awful, I apologize. But it's kind of what I think where we need to be. We need to understand who we're speaking to, and we need to make sure that we really do tailor our information so that they do not feel left out. Because a big problem in the Caribbean is that we have a lot of people feeling left out of the discussion. And especially since they're the most impacted by climate change, they not only feel left out, but they feel the most vulnerable.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rian, for that statement. And I agree with you totally. So it's like, you know, some of these things that we do, these projects, community building and capacity building, even that term, you know, like that's thrown in at the end, you know, in our procurement, in our projects, but it's something that should be integrated throughout every aspect of our renewable energy transition. It should be the first thing because the power of the Caribbean is our people.
Yes.
And when you address the people and the people feel it, you know, they're feeling it with the hurricanes.
Yeah.
So if they feel included with the solutions, and we can have a more powerful product. Now we have another. If you have time,
let's take this
we have
last
another question coming in from Drayland Johnson.
Yes.
What sort of impact have you seen in various countries by collaborating with local media in terms of reaching the general public?
So for this question, I think that it is an extremely powerful tool. We need to make sure that because local media understand how to disseminate information culturally in a local environment. So I might construct a story that will fit well with the Trinidadian narrative, but if I want to send it over to Antigua, or if I want to send it over to the British Virgin Islands, or I want to even send it over to Cuba, which is a different language, and we can't forget that we have diversity in languages as well, then the local media plays a very important role in getting that across. And I think that it is something that even in the Caribbean, we're still quite tuned into the local news. And though we get our news in different formats, even Facebook playing a very important role in how we get our news, and fake news is a whole different discussion. But local media really does allow people to connect and across age groups as well. So not only am I talking about the youth, but it's also how do we then divide that further and say, how do we talk about people who are of an older generation, and how do we connect them to this sort of topic of climate change? Because it may come quite naturally to a younger person these days, climate change, because that's what you've more or less grown up into. But to an older person who is not understanding the changes in their weather, and they feel like they're getting information through many different streams and it's quite inaccessible, and the language isn't tailored to them, how do we then now give different products to suit different audiences? So just to answer that in short, Rylan, I think it's quite important, and it really helps in terms of the diversity of the communication that we can give as well.
Agreed. Well, I know we're coming up on the end. If I can add to that piece, one thing I noticed with local media, if I think back to before we had multiple channels and we had just one TV station, there was a stronger sense of knowing about ourselves, and I think that can still happen now if we have the space for our stories to come out. And our stories, like, we are a region of storytellers. So it's definitely a process, and in many parts, but I think we're heading in the right direction. And Masaō, I thank you very much for taking the time to put this together, and I want to thank the audience as well for your questions.
Likewise.
And remember, you can engage with us beyond this.
Yes.
Because sometimes you need things to sit and sink in.
Yes. Yes, and do share as well, because this will be placed on our website, so that's CESaREjournal.org. This will be placed, the recorded version will be placed on our website, and please feel free to share to others, because like I said, we need as much exposure as we can get is the more that we can continue the conversation, and it's exactly what we want to do. And Martyn, thank you so much for having me on board today and giving Feature a bit of a podium, CESaRE a bit of a podium, and really do appreciate your hosting. And again, the audience, thanks so much. It was pretty engaging, lots of questions, and you know where to find us. So thank you so very much.
Yeah, anytime, man. All right, guys. Well, have a great end of the week, and let's get this going.
All right, see you guys. Bye.
Cheers.